Welcome to Nostalgia Trip, the show where we stroll down memory lane to see how our favorite games from the past hold up today. I'm Michael, and I'm joined by Jean-Luc, and we have a treat for all of you out there because we're going back to Black Mesa to see how Half-Life holds up today.
Get away from the shutting down. It's not shutting down. It's not.
Before Steam became an absolute giant for PC game distribution, developer Valve debuted in 1998 with the first-person shooter Half-Life on PC, and it was nothing short of revolutionary at the time. Half-Life served as the foundation for nearly every FPS that soon followed, breaking new ground for what shooters could be with its cleverly scripted combat sequences and narrative entirely told through the eyes of Gordon Freeman. Half-Life also spawned numerous mods that became great games in their own right, and one that revolutionized multiplayer shooters as well, Counter-Strike. It'd take a whole history lesson to analyze Half-Life's influence through the years, but we're here specifically to discuss why it's remembered as one of the greatest games, and whether or not you should play it today. So we understand that Half-Life is one of the most influential games of all time, but we really want to break down how the gameplay elements and how the narrative style holds up today. Jean-Luc, I want to throw it to you to talk about. I want to talk about the combat a little bit.
Okay.
So what do you like after playing it now? What are some of the things that you notice in playing Half-Life?
Well, the combat is a mixed bag today.
Okay.
Is how I would describe it. The weapon feel is a bit it's like stiff is the word for it.
Okay.
I think some weapons feel really good, but there's a lack of response from some of the enemies, I want to say, in when you're shooting them, and for yourself when you're taking damage.
Yeah.
So it's really easy to just get into a firefight and feel like, oh, I suddenly have no health. Or, in the case of, I noticed this with the Marines, when you get to the Marine section, and you get the assault rifle, which I think is a terrible assault rifle.
Yeah, I'd agree.
It's absolutely awful. And you're just sitting there and you're just shooting them and they're just soaking up bullets and you're like, eventually they'll fall down.
Yeah.
Don't shoot! I'm with the science.
Yeah, I feel that the same way when it comes to feedback and response with the weapons.
Exactly.
There are some good weapons though. The shotgun really feels like it packs a punch. Yeah, and the revolver is real dope for long-range situations especially. But what I noticed in Half-Life, when they give you all these weapons, you're constantly shuffling between the weapons to deal with different types of enemies. So when I look back at how these scripted sequences are set up, it's more of like I'm constantly responding to the different types of enemies. And I'm mentally juggling what I have to do. I mean, whether or not these weapons feel great is kind of separate from that, but the fact that I have all of these different types of weapons to use, I think that it makes these combat arenas a lot more interesting.
Yeah.
And, it's when you look at first-person shooters soon after Half-Life, they all took note of that. And in some games like Medal of Honor and Call of Duty went for scale, and they went for more realistic types of combat situations and firefights. But something about Half-Life and where they ask you to juggle all these things, I think it's something special that we might not see in many games today.
Yeah, no, I think the combat encounters, the way they're designed, is actually still pretty good. Mm-hmm. There's something about the way this game is paced where it's not a traditional shooter in the sense of you're constantly just being thrown enemies at you or scripted sequences. It's more like they will kind of mix in combat encounters with puzzle solving elements, with platforming. We'll get into that in a sec. But I think they do a good job of having interesting combat encounters where you'll come across an enemy and they're kind of placed in interesting ways, or oh, I'm gonna go this way to grab this ammo, and then there's a turret that kind of is off to the side to surprise you. And moments like that I think are kind of like where the game still shines and I was still enjoying myself when I was playing it. I was kind of surprised how much I was enjoying myself.
Yeah, me too.
When I was playing it, I don't know if I would play the whole game again because the game is damn long and kind of, I felt like it got kind of, I think the ending's kind of weak. But
I definitely want to talk about that.
Okay, we'll get to that.
But one more thing about the combat is that the enemies have very specific movesets. So it's they're not unpredictable. So once you understand how they work, you understand like the tactics that you need to use. So it's all these variables that get thrown into these combat sequences.
Yeah.
And I think that's a clever way for 1998 to make a first-person shooter a lot more interesting than what was available back then. Now, there's not just combat in Half-Life, obviously. There's also puzzle solving. There's platforming elements, which is strange for a first-person shooter, I would say, looking back at this. But in the case of Half-Life, this is how they mix up, firefights. You're not going to be constantly shooting things. You need some sort of way to take a breath from the actual combat. So you want to say your piece about platforming and puzzles in Half-Life?
So I like the idea of the platforming and puzzles. It doesn't feel good anymore, and I think a lot of it has to do with the way the movement feels. It's really slippery. You move like just a little too quick. You have to hold down like the shift key to like move really slow so that you can because you just fall off like all the time. Like this is the kind of game where you are constantly hitting F5 to save because you are gonna fall to your death so often. It's not just that there's all this platforming, is that you'll get really, really long stretches of platforming where you're just doing that and there's no combat, and I think they could have done a better job kind of mixing the two more often, I feel like. Yeah,
there's a little bit of a pacing issue that I noticed going back to it, where I was pretty burnt out on specific platforming or puzzle sequences, and going back to the slippery feel of the movement, that's classic Half-Life Gold Source engine stuff.
Totally.
And then so in a lot of those sequences, I'm just tapping W.
I
need to get to the edge of this thing so I don't fall off.
Right.
And then later on, and at the very tail end of the game, you start doing this weird sequence with teleporters and trying to combine, figuring out where these teleporters take you, lining them up with moving platforms. I'm like, okay, I get it. This isn't very fun anymore. For the time, it was this is what we can come up with to break things up.
Sure, and I like it in the early sequences, in kind of the way they design the levels, where they're really trying to make you feel like you're in this facility. There's these large, massive areas, and then these kind of small office complexes, and they're really big levels, especially for back then. And I feel like even today, by even most standard shooter campaigns, these are still pretty large levels you're dealing with. But they're almost a little too large. There's a section early on where you're going through these vents, and I just got lost because there's 5 different vents you can go through, and they go in all sorts of directions. Some of them lead to interesting secrets, others lead to nowhere. And I think they were just trying to kind of make it as big as possible. But at a certain point, I just kind of got frustrated with it.
Yeah, and that's another thing too, is that when you think about shooters or just single-player games in general today, is that there's hints, there's clear indications of where you need to go. Sometimes there's waypoints. Now, I'm not asking for all games to have waypoints. I can generally figure out where to go in games, but there's something about the way Half-Life looks and where you can get stuck pretty easily. Where do I go next? Where's a button I'm supposed to press? Did I activate the scripted sequence that leads to the next section? I don't know.
It has to do with the fact that certain doors or buttons aren't different looking from the ones that you can open. So you just kind of try every door and you try every button when you get stuck, and you're like, all right, eventually. I feel like when I was playing yesterday, I got through pretty quick, and I feel like it was just because of my knowledge of the game that I've kind of retained. And I remember when I first played it, there were definitely points where I was just getting frustrated, and I would kind of look up a guide of all right, where the hell am I supposed to go?
Hey, Mr. Freeman. I had a bunch of messages for you, but we had a system crash about 20 minutes ago, and I'm still trying to find my files. Just one of those days, I guess.
I want to jump over to the narrative style, because Half-Life really set itself apart by doing what you would call the single shot narrative, the camera never leaves Gordon's eyes.
Right.
So from the minute you start to the very end, everything is told through Gordon Freeman.
And it never jumps either.
Yeah.
Like it never skips time at all. It's all like one continuous, like you said, one continuous shot in a way, sort of.
So you essentially experience this whole thing as him. There's never anything to kind of tell you what's happening behind the scenes. You know just as much as Gordon does in terms of what's happening. Why are these Marines descending on Black Mesa? Why are these alien forces invading our universe? Whatever. So you are kind of uncovering the mystery along with him.
Right.
And it's effective. I think it's still, effective today in the sense that as I'm playing through this, I can see someone who's genuinely like, they want to see this mystery play out. Like, what is actually happening?
Yeah, I think it still totally holds up. It was way more revolutionary back when it first, when the game first came out. Like that style of storytelling, you think of like the tram scene, and the way the game like doesn't start with just shooting.
Yeah.
There's that whole extended scene around the tram, and then you're going through the facility, and then and there's a really good payoff because then you go back through the facility after the resonance cascades happened, and you see like all the damage and destruction and everyone dead, and that's like really cool storytelling. That was kind of the first game to really do that in a shooter, and that aspect isn't particularly unique anymore. Every game has kind of done that since then. I mean, like Doom 3, like stole kind of from Half-Life in a lot of ways.
Of course, yeah.
But I do think that the like specific style of storytelling of like this kind of singular focus on just a protagonist still works. I think Half-Life is one of the few series that like really nails the silent protagonist.
Yeah.
As a concept. There's something about the way Half-Life feels in its narrative and that still feels unique to Half-Life and its sequels that I feel like no game has ever truly captured.
Yeah.
And that's something that like, even though I think Half-Life is really dated, it still kind of feels unique.
Environmental storytelling, that term gets thrown around a lot nowadays, but there's something about Half-Life in where there's just like hints left all around the Black Mesa facility to kind of tell you what happened. Like
G-Man showing up in the background.
Yeah, and like the little sprinkling of G-Man every now and then. You're kind of like chasing this dude, but you kind of don't know what his deal is. And just the mess that gets left behind after this tragic event at this laboratory. It's kind of par for the course nowadays in narrative styles, but to see that play out when I was a kid, I was like genuinely fascinated.
Incredibly unique.
Yeah, incredibly unique at the time. Genuinely fascinated by the story of Black Mesa, what these scientists were doing. One thing you touched on earlier was how, in 1998, this is how storytelling was done in video games. Like the voice acting isn't great, the animations aren't great, of course. These characters don't look particularly good.
They look ugly.
But when we revisit it today, is that it almost plays out like a dark comedy in many ways.
Yeah, it's like watching a B movie. It's like I think some of it was intentional. I think other parts of it weren't. But it added this like goofy charm to it, where there'd be this one scientist who's like, "Oh, hello, Gordon." I'm like, let me help you get through this area. And like while he's talking to me, there's just a dude behind him who's like being like strangled and like choked to death by this alien. Or you'd have this guy be like, let me come unlock that door for you, and then he like immediately gets shot or something. And the AI is so bad that it just kind of added to like the ridiculousness of it. Like it felt so silly, and I was having a lot of fun with that. Yeah, and
you were mentioning that you can ask security guards to watch your back or give you cover, and then you would be engaging with enemy aliens, and then this fool is trying to shoot the aliens too, but he's like hitting you in the back.
Yeah, he was like
in front of him.
He was shooting me in the back.
Got one.
Going back to it now, it has that charm because of how ridiculous it is, and like asking scientists, "Hey, follow me," and they're like, "Oh, I can't follow you anymore. I'm not going any further." There's a lot of funny things in Half-Life.
Whoa!
Have I been that much of a burden?
So I mentioned earlier that I think the game quality sort of falls near the end, and you said you actually played a bit of the ending recently.
I played about the last third of the entire game.
So
through
all the
yesterday.
Zen nonsense.
All the Zen. This game goes from 0 to 100 real quick. It's kind of bizarre in the sense that, I was talking about uncovering the mystery of what Black Mesa was doing. And then you get to a point where there's teleporters, and then you reach a point where it's like, all right, we're gonna set this portal up, and then you're gonna go into this other world that's in space and to fight the mother alien or whatever the hell's going on. It turns into this like space low gravity platformer.
Did you enjoy it? Because I remember even back when the game came out, people didn't like Zen.
Yeah, I wasn't particularly fond of it because like there's no real boss battles in Half-Life, and that's cool, but there's just this spider with a big sack that you just keep shooting, and then it runs through different areas of this alien world, and you keep chasing it and you keep shooting it, and not that it has to make sense, but it just felt pretty out of place and
compared to the rest of the game.
Compared to the rest of the game. And then when I played it just a couple days ago, I was reminded, I was like, oh yeah, this is like really weird. I don't necessarily think that sequence is like that ending part is great, but that last bit where G-Man is talking to you and kind of tying it all back together was, I remember what that felt like to make it to the end of the game and, not necessarily find out what he's all about, but, to have this guy talking to you and still have a lot of mystery left even after the conclusion of the game. So there are bits and pieces where I think that the ending of Half-Life pays off, but also has me scratching my head, even to this day.
Yeah, because we'll never know now. We'll never know.
There won't be a Half-Life 3, man.
Oh.
I have recommended your services to my employers, and they have authorized me to offer you a job. They agree with me that you have limitless potential.
But should you play Half-Life 1? That's the question.
Yes, so that was what our opening question is. That's the whole point of the show, Nostalgia Trip. But I think that for me, I would answer that by saying, what do you want? Like, do you want to play something that's really fun, that's very exciting in terms of combat and storytelling? And I would say that you should play Half-Life if your objective is to understand the history of games, where first-person shooters came from, and to kind of be a historian and document, you know, how much things have changed since 1998. But if you ask me like, oh, if there's what shooter should I play? I'm probably not gonna recommend Half-Life.
No, I would almost recommend Black Mesa if that's your objective. It's just to play a fun shooter, which is for those who don't know, it's a fan recreation of Half-Life that they've been working on for like 10 plus years at this point, and you can get it on Steam. They're still working on it. They're almost got Zen in there.
Oh, geez.
The best part. If anything, I was like, oh no, you're done. You don't need to.
You don't need to include that. Take you straight to G-Man.
I'm curious to see if they actually like change it and stuff.
Because, like how it gets pulled off.
Exactly, because I do think the game actually does a good job of recreating the good parts of Half-Life, but also not feeling afraid to change things and improve on things when they need to. The shooting feels a lot better. It uses the Half-Life 2 engine, so they incorporate like
a lot of physics
puzzles and stuff like that. If you're just looking for like a good, like, oh, what's the best version of Half-Life in like a modern sense, it'd probably be that version. Yeah. But yeah, if you're looking from like an archival sort of like, I'm like a video game archaeologist who wants to uncover this game, then yeah, check out the original or check out the Source. I played the original version, and
I played Half-Life Source.
You played Source. They're mostly the same except for a couple changes to
better textures,
some
native
water
wide
stuff.
Water looks better.
I think some of the physics is a little different in Source.
There's like native widescreen, so it plays extremely well on modern machines. I mean, we always recognize Half-Life as one of the greatest games of all time. Whether or not it holds up today is kind of, I would say no, but it's still important to recognize its place in history, because if you think about between 1998, where Half-Life 1 came out, and Half-Life 2 came out in 2004, games rapidly evolved between them. That's a 6-year gap in which a lot of games took notes from Half-Life, and you said this earlier as well, is that when you revolutionize a genre and everyone wants to pull elements from you, you end up looking like the most dated game. And I think that's what happened to Half-Life. Because even when I replayed it leading up to the release of Half-Life 2, I was like, oh man, this might not be as great as I remember it. But that's because there's so many games that pulled from Half-Life to kind of create their own great games. So in that sense, I think that Half-Life is still valuable to play to see where games came from.
Right. There you go. You don't have to play it, but you gotta respect it.
Yes, put some respect on Half-Life. That's our episode of Nostalgia Trip. Let us know in the comments what you think, how you feel about Half-Life today, and we'll see you next time.
Welcome to Gravehoppers, the show where we put permadeath into every game.
No!
You die in a game, you move on to the next.
Oh my god, dude, you had no health.
Join us live every Thursday, 2 p.m. Pacific. Don't miss it.
What hit me?